Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm Paloma Moraga. I'm part of the Screen team. So today you will see me a lot because I will be introducing each of the sessions. I would like to start also to saying thank you. I think it's a good way to start the morning. So thank you to the Instituto de Salud Carlos III for hosting the meeting. Thank you to ECRIN for the compromise to improve the clinical trials practice. And thank you to my team, to Screen, for the organization, and to Alberto. You are such an inspiration, always active and trying to come in with new ideas. So I'll try to make it short, this introduction. We are so happy for being able to hosting this year this event. As you know, it's the 20th anniversary. So I wanted this event to be memorable. So when I thought about how would I like this day to be, I thought that I would like to be incredible. Because many times we are not aware of how unique are the moments in life. So I want you to be aware how unique is this moment, how incredible. And I love word games, so I've changed the word incredible to say ecrindable. Okay, so this is the word of the event, hashtag ecrindable. And just to wake up everybody, because we are gonna be starting right now, I will be asking you, how is this day going to be? And I want you to shout, not to say, to shout, ecrindable, okay? Okay, yeah, that's the attitude. Okay, so let's do it. How is this day going to be? Ecrindable! Thank you. Big applause to you. Oh, yeah. Okay, so the first session, which is for setting the scene, we're going to start by what is inclusivity, defining the key words for a common understanding. And we have the pleasure to have Tamás Bereczky, social psychology, Deutsche, Aidshilfe, EUPATI. So please come here.
I think I know what to do. But yeah, it's here. Here we go. That's shown.
Yeah,
so
probably that one. Yeah, Thomas.
That's me.
That one is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So good morning, everyone. Strangely enough, I have stage fright now. I'm a routine speaker, yet it's such an honor and such a pleasure to be here with you. And thank you very much for having me. It's still not very common for a social scientist, which I am, and also for a patient to speak at an event like this. This will become important and this will matter. I will also need, thank you. That's me. I will also I will have two questions for you on Slido, so that's why I didn't start this presentation yet. So it is still not very customary for clinical research to take a look at social sciences and especially to take a look at the patient's perspective. And I'm standing here today not just as a social scientist, but also as a patient representative, as a patient expert. Now, what I want to talk to you about is, under the title of Setting the Scene, is a little bit the history, the theoretical framework for what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean as political concepts, as scientific concepts, but also what the implications are in terms of clinical research and science. And I wanted to start, actually I want to start by setting a timer because I'm a talker, so I drift very easily. So I want to start with a little bit of self-reflection for all of you, for all of us. And so therefore, we have 2 questions for you in Slido. Get your phones out. And so the first question is, do you consider yourself part of any minority or underrepresented group? (26, 33 people). Okay. Looks like a competition. It's exciting. So I would say 95. Okay, I don't know the exact number of you in the room, but I would say we're beyond 100. So let's say this is representative now for our group. But the majority of you, even if this is a narrow margin, but the majority of you say that you don't consider yourself being part of any minority or any underrepresented group. Needless to say, as we move forward, I will try to prove to you how this is relevant, how this is a very important aspect, how you yourself see yourself in the world, how you yourself see yourself and your organization situated in the world. Let's move on to the next question. And this is going to produce a colorful word cloud at the end. But my question to you is, what is today, right now in this moment, the most important identity label that describes you best? So what are you at this moment right here? Are you a scientist? Are you a politician? Are you a parent? Are you a patient? Or are you something entirely different? Coming on well. Let's wait for 100 replies. Some of you are even undecided. I wonder what's... Okay. So it is apparently most of you sit here in this room, and that's very reasonable as scientists. Also, a lot of you are parents, and interestingly, quite many of you see themselves as humans today. I can relate to that. And then obviously all the other labels, all the other identities. Identity elements, rather, that may come into play. Again, I would like you to reflect on this while I talk and also while we go through the day, and keep in mind all the time that you yourself also come to this table with your own labels and with your own identity elements that do influence your way of thinking and your approach to how you do your work, how you do science. So while we still tend to believe that we as scientists have the God's eye view, that we can have an all-encompassing objectivity, it is not actually always true, or not necessarily true, but you bring all these other elements from your own life, from your own identity into your work. And that's also one very important aspect of working with diversity, working with inclusion and equity. So also to reflect on this from maybe a different and a more personal perspective, standing here in front of you, I know how I look. I look like a white, middle-aged, middle-class man. So I would be your typical clinical trial population. At the same time, I also live with HIV, I have a history of mental illness, I have a history of substance use, and I could go on with a lot of other aspects that would be immediate exclusion criteria if it came to a clinical trial, right? So it is not that straightforward. You have to take a nuanced view on how the world looks like. So this is what I'm going to talk about a little more. Today, I have no conflicts of interest to disclose in relation to this talk. Let's start with the basic definitions. What is diversity? Diversity, and this is like the classical definition from Wikipedia, is the representation and participation of diverse groups of people, including all these different aspects or axes that are there that define or may define a person, and this definition also says that diversity should be seen as an important asset. Well, let's see. What is equity? Equity is ensuring fair treatment, access and opportunity for all, while working to eliminate barriers that have prevented full participation and access, right? We could take this apart, but since most of you are scientists here, I will not go into a lot of detail with what this definition entails. You can probably understand this. And then we come to inclusion, which means that you foster an environment where everyone feels respected, valued, and able to contribute, and feels like they are at the table and facilitated to contribute. Now that becomes tricky, doesn't it, right? Do you really allow everyone to sit at the table? Do you really foster an environment in which everyone, including patients, including underrepresented, sometimes invisible populations, to sit at the table? And is that even possible? Now, if you look at that, then the question may arise, fine, we have these three concepts which also seem to be overlapping, but then what might be in the middle? And there's a lot of thought going into this by philosophers, by social scientists, and also by politicians. And we find increasingly that what is in the middle is justice, right? So that's the overlap. Or sometimes we call it social justice, but I don't want to go any deeper into that part of the definition because we have more important things to talk about. But let's just say that where these three concepts overlap, that's actually about justice. So these are the broad topics that I will try to cover today. I will speak about intersectionality as an operational aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I will talk about the importance of intersectionality in health. I will also a little bit talk about artificial intelligence in health. And I will try to argue to you why we believe, especially coming from the patient side, that diversity in clinical research is a scientific necessity and is utterly unavoidable. So let's get to intersectionality, and I don't know to what extent you are familiar with this word, which has also gained a little bit of bad taste over the last 5 to 8 years, I would say, and I will also show you why. So intersectionality, this approach, is the acknowledgement that within groups of people that have a common identity, and this common identity can be their gender identity, sexuality, religion, race, or any other defining aspect, that even within such a homogeneous or apparently homogeneous group, there will be differences defined by the various combinations of these very identity elements that we were talking about in the beginning when we did this mini poll. And that the person, how the person fares in the world, how they live their lives, how they are successful or not, is defined by this intersection of different oppressions and privileges. The traditional definition just goes with different oppressions, but recently we've also added the aspect of privileges to it, because it's not just your oppressions that define you, it's also your privileges, it's also what you can do as opposed to what you cannot do that define you. So it's a more refined definition than what you will find probably in most course books. Where does this concept come from? And this mainly comes from feminism and from the fight for equal rights for women, especially for the right to vote. But it didn't stop there. It happened at the same time what is called the movement of movements, 60s, 70s, early 80s, when the Black Civil Rights Movement, the latest wave of, the third wave of feminism, but also the movement for gay rights was in full motion. So these were the Reagan years and the Thatcher years in the UK, where especially black women started noticing something very interesting when they looked at feminism and how it evolved. And they suddenly found that, and they also looked at the Black Civil Rights Movement, and they suddenly found that even within the Black Civil Rights Movement, they were still not treated as equal. So that suddenly they found that within the Black Civil Rights Movement, women were still second-class citizens or even third-class citizens, right? So they were not just not white, they were also not male. And so they found these scholars, especially Bell Hooks, who's not a scholar really, she's more an author, but also others, Sojourner Truth and a bunch of other, especially black women, found that apparently there's something important going on here. So it's not just one aspect like your race or your gender that will define how successful or unsuccessful you are in society. And then came along Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a lawyer, a scholar of law, still active and publishing and working a lot, also subject to a lot of criticisms. It's a very interesting conversation if you look at this. But Kimberly Crenshaw could prove through a series of, or examining a series of legal cases across the US, that actually there is a difference in how black women are treated within the jurisdiction, within the legal system of the US. And so she published a number of case studies about this. One of them became extremely well-known and famous, the related TED Talk. You can take a look at it on YouTube. So she could prove actually through the analysis of these cases that that there is in fact this underlying strand of discrimination within the legal system in the US that is more nuanced than it could be just reduced to race or gender or any other term. And so she proposed that there is an intersection of these various axes of discrimination or difference, if you like, which will define how well the person fares. So then it bifurcated into an immense debate. Of course, there was a huge pushback. And currently, we actually see three debates happening in this area. One is this very academic debate that Crenshaw started and still continues, which is about this very strict definition of what intersectionality, what this perspective means, how you look at the world from a different aspect. But also there's another conversation going on, which is based on how activists and activism was operationalizing these concepts and was working with the disparities and differences across groups. And this is actually how one interesting thing came about, which you may have heard about, especially if you listen to the criticism that comes from the US currently against intersectionality and DEI. And this is the concept of the Oppression Olympics. I don't know whether you've heard about this, but the Oppression Olympics goes like this. Okay, I'm white, middle class, and a middle-aged man, but I belong to a sexual minority. I'm also a patient. And I come from Eastern Europe, so my truth is better than your truth because I'm more oppressed. Or you may say that, oh, well, yeah, okay, but I'm black, I'm a woman, and I come from poverty. My truth is more true because I'm even more oppressed than you are. So this is what we describe as the Oppression Olympics. And this is a purely political concept, right? So this has got nothing to do with science. And this is why I'm telling you this, because this has then become the foundation for all the criticism, for all the critique that then came with the pushback, especially from the right, from conservative thinkers and activists, saying that this is nonsense, because if you take this to the extreme, then this will atomize society, right? So then every single individual will be defined individually by their oppressions, right? So then where does this leave this? What are groups then even, right? Can you even have groups on this, or groups of people, populations on this basis? Once again, this has become a political debate. So that right now, what we talk about in terms of DEI, that's a purely political concept, that's an ideology, while diversity and inclusion in biomedical science is a necessity. And in the rest of my talk, I try to speak about why that is the case. For that, I also wanted to bring in another person that I recommend that you familiarize yourself with them, and this is Rikki Wilkins. Rikki Wilkins, they are a philosopher, and comes from sociology. And they found something very interesting and described something very interesting, which is that starting from what Kimberly Crenshaw and Bell Hooks said about black women and girls, Rikki Wilkins found that actually that oppression, that discrimination that's inherent in the system, that is reflected in the bodies and in the lives of black women and girls. So that the reason why they are more prone to certain illnesses, why they are more prone to more fragile health, is related to their position in society, right? So that whatever happens to you as a person will be reflected in your health. It will be reflected in your body, in your physical being. Now, this has become very, very instructive and very important, especially in the field of HIV, where I come from and where I've done most of my work. So that you recognize that your health is shaped by a number of dimensions, by all these different aspects that are not just biological, but that are also social. So that your social environment, your standing, will determine your health and will have a profound impact on your health, including, for example, stigma and discrimination. And we know that, we know this from the work of Erving Goffman, that stigma is there in every disease, so it's not just like the typically stigmatizing illnesses like visible illnesses or skin diseases or HIV, but for every kind of disease, there's very interesting literature about that, and also that entire groups, therefore, can become stigmatized, so that health and your health status becomes one of these aspects in intersectionality, and conversely, how your health is defined by your different axes of identity in society are interrelated and come together. So all of this is ultimately about embodiment, right? And this is something that we tend to forget, that patients and your trial participants and people that you work with, also your colleagues, are embodied human beings, right? So these are physical, we live in physical bodies within a physical environment, and this environment has many different impacts on us. So that living in a certain place, living under certain conditions, being part of a certain population or a certain group of people can have the same impact on your health as if you were hit by a car or diagnosed with cancer, right? It's just maybe not that fast or abrupt, but it will have the same impact, or can have the same impact. So, hello. Yeah. Let me give you very quickly an example for what this means, and that's HIV and mental health. There are many overlaps between the risk of exposure to HIV and mental health. There's been a lot of research going into this, and we also know that both the physical and the psychological manifestations of these exposures are there even on an epidemiological scale. We know that men who have sex with men have a much higher rate of depression, of chronic anxiety, and of suicide and suicidal ideation. We also know that both in HIV and for men who have sex with men, there's a much higher rate of substance use, of chemsex, smoking. Chemsex is sexualized drug use, so having sex on drugs. Also novel forms of drug use and HIV, viral hepatitis, TB. So all of these things, these different epidemics actually come together into a syndemic, and that's also how we look at this from an epidemiological perspective in HIV by now. At the same time, we also know that the picture is not that clear because there's there's generally a very high burden of mental disease for mental health across the world. Yet, if you look at the numbers, then we do see that that there is a marked difference between the general population and sexual minorities, especially men who have sex with men. And so along came Robert Remian, who's a psychiatrist from the US, who described very precisely those different domains where this overlap is there between HIV and mental health challenges, or the risk to contract HIV and mental health challenges. So he mapped out these different aspects. SES means here. SES means socioeconomic status. So he mapped out and he found that actually these things all will increase, if you somehow have a problem in these domains, then that will increase your risk for contracting HIV, but also will increase your risk for living with a mental disorder. So there's something very interesting that you can detect here, and this is not something that Remian said, but actually this is the exact same concept, right? So what happens is that Remian described these different domains, these different axes that will define a person's identity, and without mentioning the word intersectionality, he came to the same conclusion that actually there's something intersectional going on, happening with people at risk of contracting HIV and living with mental conditions or at risk of mental health challenges. So this actually does come together, and this is by now highly acknowledged or recognized in the literature as well. So, why does this matter then to us and to this audience especially? Because we know that while I think I could aptly demonstrate how diverse people are in general, we also know, and Sean will talk to this in more detail after this talk, that clinical trial populations do lack diversity. So that clinical trial populations have been chronically white and male, and that, for example, female bodies are underrepresented, right? So there's very little research done into female bodies. And that certain populations are even invisible. They are untouchable. And then we say, but they are so hard to reach, right? These are the hard to reach populations. Actually, they are not hard to reach if you know where they are. Sex workers, people who use drugs. You can say, well, people who use drugs, who cares? Such a small population, right? But then think about the opioid crisis in the US. Those are people who use drugs. Millions of people who are addicted to synthetic opioids. Do you exclude them from clinical trials? Because they are actually also middle-class white men. What do you do in this case, right? So, and they become invisible, they are erased. So it's not just a racial bias that you will find there or a gender bias, but there's a much deeper level of bias that we find if you look at the whole picture. Also, language bias, everything happens in English. But you know that we're still a minority. I mean, English speakers are still a minority in the world, and there are scientists who produce excellent science in other languages. Are you aware of those people? Are you aware of all the science that's being done in Russian, for example? You see, so how much politics will influence and hegemonic power structures will influence science. This shouldn't happen. And that's also part of diversity. And so this means that we are basing all our thinking, all our data on biased knowledge, on biased thinking. This raises a number of methodological questions, and I would like to focus on one of these methodological questions, which is this conflict between individualism and communalism. Why does that matter? Because if you look at these two different approaches, do you look at things from an epidemiological perspective, or do you look at things from an individual perspective? Then very soon you come to the question where you have to decide how far can you go with personalized medicine? What's the point when personalized medicine stops making sense? Because after all, you do need populations that you can study, right? So you need a certain degree of homogeneity in your data in order to do meaningful research. And we know how much debate there is about this in rare diseases, for example, where it's so difficult to scrape together a meaningful population because maybe you have just 2,000 patients across the world. So how do you handle that situation? So it does matter how far you go with acknowledging individualism and with acknowledging this very delicate border between populations and people, individual people. So let me give you a toddler's view on AI at this case, because we don't have time for more. But basically what happens in artificial intelligence is that you dump an immense amount of data into a model, and then this model will systematically crawl this data and look for patterns, and then translates these patterns into vectors. And then depending on the salience of these vectors and depending on the queries that you make to an artificial intelligence model, it will select from those patterns the ones that stand out the most, right? So, but this is a very, very, very simplified approach. And this is also compounded by another thing that we sometimes forget, and I will wrap up very quickly, which is that for AI, there's also, especially for commercially available models, there's an imperative to answer. For an AI model saying, I don't know, or your question doesn't make sense, that option doesn't exist, right? It must give an answer. So what happens if we don't have data? And we don't have data. We don't have data of all of these different populations. We don't have data on migrants because it's very difficult to do clinical trials in migrant populations, right? Because you don't know if that given person will stay in that given location for the next 90 months. So 36 months. So what do you do? So there's not real research into the health of migrant populations. Trans people, again, you can say, well, who cares? But actually, for example, cervical cancer in trans men is a massive problem. The same way testicular cancer or anal cancer for trans women is a massive problem. Where do these people go? They are not just underserved, they are invisible. They don't have access to services. And if you add up the numbers, it's not such a few people after all. Sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, people who use drugs, because you cannot do research with recreational drugs for ethical reasons. Elderly, children, women of childbearing age. So all these populations are systematically under-researched and underserved. So we don't have data about them, and these are actually for HIV, these are populations. So what you get in AI, and this is why this matters so much, is actually an analogous to GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. We have NINO, nothing in, nothing out. There's no data to feed into your models, so you will not get answers. Or the worst thing that will happen is you get hallucinations as answers, right? Because oftentimes that AI model must give you an answer, so they will come up with one that sounds plausible. How is this an opportunity for all of us? This means that actually you can build better models based on better data. You just need to collect those data. And how do you do that? Because again, hard to reach populations. You do that with patients together. You do that by relying on real-world evidence, on real-world data. You do that by expanding your classical remit of clinical research into systematically collecting real-world evidence together with patients, because it's us. I know where these people are. I know where people who use drugs are, and my peers in patient organizations also know that. I know where trans sex workers are, right, because they are our clients. Those are the people that we work with. So if you do this together with patient communities, if you establish this connection and come down to the level of real life, then it becomes you get better data, you get better AI, and obviously you also get better outcomes. So you need to collect more knowledge, and maybe this means that you need to adopt new research methodologies, and then you also need to merge these biomedical data with that social knowledge, with that social psychological information, which will lead to more robust outcomes. And that ends my talk. So thank you very much for your attention. Do you have questions now? Okay.
Okay, so now it's time for the questions. So, yeah, Martina will be with the microphone. Are there any questions here or online? Martina.
Testing.
Okay, so maybe one question online related to the last slide and IA, and maybe could you please elaborate on the unregulated premature adoption of IA enhanced tool in different steps of clinical trial? So meaning patient selection, translation of relevant material, opposed to IA washing. So since the large language models are cultural and language based, jeopardizing inclusivity and diversity, and of course data privacy. So I think maybe it's a very large question and maybe difficult to answer, but thank you.
It is, but I want to, maybe I just, the simplest way is that I suggest this different approach, which comes from an American philosopher, his name is Lanier, who suggests that AI is merely a new form of collaboration. That it's not a new entity, it's not a new person. We're not creating new life, we're not creating a new person, we're creating with the AI a new form of human collaboration. That we dump all the data into, well, willingly or unwillingly, this is a different conversation, but we dump all the data into a platform, and we cooperate with others through this platform. And if you use this paradigm in your thinking, then that makes it a lot easier. And so it's not like there's new knowledge emerging from AI. It's just that it's organized differently. But it's still the same knowledge that your colleagues have. They have always had this knowledge. It's just in one place. And you can interact with this in a different way. So maybe that's like a summary question or answer to this question.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. About diversity and including more of the populations that you talked about, like the invisible populations in clinical trials. I think this is also probably a loaded question. But my own personal experience, my career I spent working in large cancer centers in the US. So these are places where people have good health insurance. They're in wealthier communities. And so pretty narrow populations that were recruited to these clinical trials, relatively speaking. So the question I have is what's happening, I guess looking at Europe specifically, what's happening more to increase the diversity, addressing the populations that you mentioned, and are current regulations supportive of that in terms of designing protocols that can accommodate those populations?
I think that people who are here from the IHI Ready Consortium, their eyes are lighting up now, because that's the exact project by the European Union, we're funded by the European Union and the consortium of other stakeholders, that is working for the next 6 years on including underrepresented and underserved populations in clinical research. But there are also other projects happening on the level of patient communities. Like there's one project that I'm working in, I will shamelessly plug this. It's called CORE, Community Action to Reduce Inequalities, which is about supporting small community-based organizations on the ground. These are the organizations of sex workers, people who live with HIV, gay health, trans health. These are really tiny, I wouldn't even call them patient organizations because they're not necessarily patients. And these organizations do outreach and testing and linkage to care, which also means obviously linkage to research. But they do primarily linkage to care for these underserved populations. So these are people, and it's very cheap, right? It's like a tiny amount of money that you have to give to these organizations so that they can buy tests, so that they can keep their offices open, also in the evening when people have time to get tested. Or they go into migrant communities, like they consciously go there, they speak their language. So, and there's a plethora of similar projects happening in the EU, but this can be replicated. And again, it's simple, straightforward, and it's ridiculously cheap. Why not do it?
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. I have a question and a comment. The question is that perhaps it is necessary, or it is a lack in your presentation, of elaborating in which way, when you are doing a survey, people is telling the truth. Because there is relevant and reliable data that not all the times the data we are collecting are really the truth, because there is mismatch with other types of information. And it is also a relevant question. For instance, in the slide that you have presented, very few people have ticked gay. And taking into account the amount of people that we are here, it is unlikely that so many clicks has been on gay. This is an example. So that means that something is that many times the answer we are collecting is biased by the level of the expected answer that we are willing to collect. This is one question. And I would like you can elaborate a little bit on that. And second, we need to be aware that we should resolve the bias that we have. This is clear. But we need also to expect that after resolving the bias, there will be new bias, because the reality is not static, it's dynamic. And this is also a relevant question for everything. Last but not least, when you mention women, we need to distinguish between women and women in pregnancy, because this is also an even more underrepresented population, and kids, etc., etc. I don't want to extend more, but I would like you can elaborate a little bit about the not telling the truth, or how to assess this problem that is a relevant matter when we are collecting sociological data. Thank you very much.
So I think that two things that come to mind. One is we're not going to be able to solve this today, right? So this is not. This is more like a paradigm change that is also forced upon us by the increased use of big data and artificial intelligence. So we just have to go. We have to go with this, and we have to take a different. My impression is that we just simply have to take a different look at what is happening, and where's the value in this deluge of data that we have. Just the sheer amount of data in itself is not a value. I think that's also important to see. But at the same time, we had this very interesting experience in a previous IMI project or IHI project. It was just right in the beginning, or at this when they transformed themselves, where a big database, a big data database was built from hematological data for the use on a European level. And so we were systematically looking at an inordinate amount of clinical trials data, including quality of life data. And you know what we found was that even if quality of life data were collected during clinical trials, they were not included in the database. And that's a total waste. That's exactly what you need, right? Because many patients many patients, and there's research into that, they don't care about overall survival. They want to have enough time to say goodbye to their loved ones. They want quality of life, and it's their choice. But if you discard quality of life data because all you focus on is overall survival, then you don't serve your patients, right? So then it becomes, yes, there's bias, but there's also avoidable bias that we shoot ourselves in the leg. So why are we collecting those data if we are not using them? And why are we not using them if we are collecting them? So I think it's just, it's a very bad, and the list goes on and on and on. I mean, you know how a matrix of events can look like why the hell do you want to do bone biopsy every 3 months? I mean, of course patients will drop out from that trial. And then you even discard that data? I like this, no, that's nonsense. So there's a lot of change that we can do on the very fundamental level before we even come to these broader conversations about how to tackle bias. And yes, there will be bias always, yes. Thank you.